the debate. And then also online, we have Moki Makura, who is the Executive Director of Africa No Filter. And between us, we're going to try and take you through a look ahead at 2024, the global year of more elections than we've ever had before, a global year where we're also seeing conflict. We're seeing increasing numbers of extreme weather events that are challenging all of us. But at the same time, we are seeing young people taking the stage more and more, making their views known. And we are seeing creativity from the continent that is influencing whatever is happening in other places, be it in the creative sectors or be it in politics and economics. Because the creative industries go behind so many things that we take in our everyday lives, whether it's design, whether it's color, whether it is technology, there is creativity behind it. So without further ado, I would like to open up the debate in our traditional way of doing it with the politics. And I'm going to invite Patrick to give us an overview of the political landscape for Africa in 2024, including, of course, elections, but also including some of the other wider trends that we see across the continent. Patrick, I hope we can see you, definitely. I hope we can hear you. Over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for the intro. I'll shout as loud as I can. I'm actually in Accra as we speak. On the electoral front, it is a big year. There are 18 different elections across the continent this year. That's the conditions of 300 million people are being put to the vote, and parties are competing for victory in those elections. I think in the kind of order of the running for the year, the first big election is going to be in Senegal, the middle of next month. And that's been very much looked forward to because of the question of whether Macky Sall, the incumbent president, was going to seek a third term or not. It's turned out that he's not. And he has been backing his Prime Minister, Amadou Ba, for the presidency. But he faces a really tough challenge from a younger generation of politicians led by Ousmane Sonko, who has had a number of legal run-ins with the government. And they have the courts, police in Senegal have leveled sexual harassment charges against Sonko. He's fighting that in jail. His supporters say that it's a setup by the government. The government says it's just got to let the justice system run its course. What that means now, it seems, is that Sonko is not going to be eligible as he fights this case in the courts to stand in the elections, but they have nominated his colleague from his opposition party to run against him. But the feeling most people have is that this is going to split the opposition vote in several different ways. Another prominent opposition campaigner, Khalifa Sall, is standing, who achieved quite a lot of popularity, but is not thought to have the network necessary to take on the ruling coalition. So that happens in the middle of February. The next big election that is really going to exercise political interest is going to be the South African one for several reasons. I mean, just one on the calendar side of things, it's 30 years since the liberation election brought Nelson Mandela to power in the first free elections South Africa has ever seen, and it brought the African National Congress as the biggest party in the country to power. So it's been in power for 3 decades. And a lot of people are looking at that legacy and saying, well, what has the ANC delivered over that time? The positives and, of course, the negatives that we're seeing a lot about. should also be remembered that there are more people going to be voting in these elections who were not around, the so-called born frees, who were not around when those first elections were took place in '94. So it's quite a milestone for South Africa in many ways. The other important point about the elections is that 340 parties have registered to compete, and they're right across the spectrum, from self-styled left-wing parties of various persuasions and self-styled right-wing parties of various persuasions, and a bit of a bunching in the middle of the political spectrum. Center, I mean, the ANC sort of qualifies as center-left, and the Democratic Alliance qualifies as center-right, with stretching out across that spectrum. And you see quite a lot of people seem to think the ANC is not going to get the magic 50% threshold, which would give it a majority in Parliament, and therefore the right to run a government exactly how they like. They pick the president, they pick the ministers, and they implement their policies, knowing that they've got a majority of MPs to back them in after the elections. Because the South African system is a parliamentary system, not a presidential one. So it's absolutely vital that they get that parliamentary majority. The latest betting is that the ANC could just fail to get that 50%, but their share of the vote won't go down so radically to say below 45%, where they would need to cast their lot in with another big party, either the Economic Freedom Fighters Party or the Democratic Alliance. So they could be forced into a coalition, but with a smaller grouping that would not ask for too high concessions politically. The other two elections, which I think are really going to be closely fought, in Mozambique in October and Ghana in November. And in both elections, you've got questions of debt looming very large on citizens' concerns, questions of funding and investment. Mozambique is about to launch one of the biggest gas projects in the world, with the French Total Energies company there onshore, and the US ExxonMobil company making a massive investment in the northeast of the country. The question is how much of the largesse from those big gas projects are the people going to see, and I think that's going to play out as a question in the elections, where the ruling Frelimo party is going to face some quite tough opposition from the two main opposition parties, who've got quite a powerful spread across the region. But again, Frelimo has that liberation fighters card on its side, and it also has a pretty powerful national network. But it's likely to be tested quite seriously. And we saw the dispute last year over the local elections, in which Frelimo was accused very widely of fixing the totals. So I think it's going to be a close election there. And where I am right now in Ghana, there's no question that it's going to be a really close election in Ghana. The economy is going to weigh very heavily on the results, on the outcome of the election, I think. The country defaulted on its external debt. It entered into a really tough debt restructuring program the beginning of last year. It now seems, according to the central bank governor, to be getting out of the woods, but it's had to do so by the government imposing very tough fiscal discipline, which in lay person's terms means cutting government spending, often reducing government employees, and generally imposing hardships on the population to get out the other side. And that's a sort of pretty tough recipe to impose on people in the run-up to election. And it's very difficult to see how the ruling National New Patriotic Party is going to make itself popular enough. The Deputy President, Bawumia, is going to be standing against the former President John Mahama, and that's now scheduled for November, about the time of the US elections. So in the past, it was the case that the Ghana elections were historically run much better than the US elections, and certainly without the rancor that we've seen in recent times. It's going to be a matter of interest globally for us journalists to see if they're going to keep up that tradition. I should just say a few more words about some of the non-electoral things to watch out for. Kenya had elections 18 months ago, and they too are dealing with the kind of economic overhang, debt pressures, and so on. And it seems that the Ruto government, again, is determined to sort of batten down the hatches and try and tough it out, hoping they can get through the current debt pressures and then start raising money on the international markets again, and pushing some financial programs out to the wider electorate in the run-up to the following election. And then in Nigeria, you've got a similar economic picture where the Bola Tinubu government came to power last May. Again, had a very tough economic inheritance. The Nigerian naira is tumbling on the parallel exchange rates, and the government's policy, initially widely applauded, of cutting the fuel subsidies, has had the knock-on effect of pushing up the prices of most commodities, obviously gasoline and diesel, but a lot of the commodities that are transported around the region. And the government has come under fire for not doing enough to roll out socially compensatory measures to people to give them some resilience against the tougher economic circumstances. So I think it's going to be a year of testing Tinubu's shock therapy in Nigeria. Having done all these radical economic reforms, is he going to be able to go back to the markets and say, well, come on, invest in Nigeria, biggest economy on the continent, 230 million people. We've done all the made all the economic decisions. About time you put your money where your mouth is, as it were. And so I think it's going to be a test for the Nigerian government in terms of how it can manage the economy. Just a couple of final things, perhaps, on the regional scene. On Sunday lunchtime, the state television in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso announced that the juntas in those countries had decided to pull out of the regional grouping, the Economic Community for West African States. And on the face of that, that is pretty disastrous. I mean, it's disastrous for both sides. It's a bit like sort of Britain pulling out of the EU along with maybe Italy and Spain all at the same time. It's going to be pretty torturous if it goes through. A lot of people are hoping it won't, and it's just posturing by the military. But right now, it looks deadly serious. And it's going to mean that those three military-ruled states, they're all landlocked, in theory, are going to be excluded from access to the sea and therefore from maritime trade, which again, it's difficult to see how that can continue. ECOWAS at the moment are taking a rather relaxed attitude, pointing out that actually you can't just walk out of ECOWAS. It takes a year to negotiate your exit, and they hope, I guess, that they will enter into some sort of negotiations. So you've got that going on in the Sahelian states and West Africa, and you've got a similar effect in the Horn of Africa, where you have the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, which was seen as the great hope to negotiate some sort of ceasefire and settlement in the Sudan conflict, has now been split open on a couple of issues. First of all, the former military head of state, well, he regards himself as the existing military head of state in Sudan, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. Others would contest that title right now. He's taken his government out of IGAD, saying that they're not paying him due respect, and he is not prepared to sit down and talk to the leader of the Rapid Support Forces, Mohammed Hamdan Daglo Hemeti, at the same table on an equal footing. Doesn't regard Hemeti as a viable interlocutor, which makes serious ceasefire discussions very, very difficult. So that's one fissure within IGAD. The other one, of course, is Ethiopia's decision to recognize the territorial rights of Somaliland over the breakaway state of Somaliland, which broke away from Somalia in 1991, recognizing that their territorial integrity in exchange for a port on the Gulf of Aden. And that, again, has split the regional organization with Djibouti, Eritrea, and Somalia, all saying Ethiopia had no right to do that. They don't recognize it. And, of course, Somaliland and Ethiopia doubling down on that. So in both cases, you've got these regional organizations which are so important to the bigger project of an African Continental Free Trade Authority area. Those building blocks are currently being held back by these political disputes. So that's really, I guess that's going to be one of the top issues at the African Union meeting next month to resolve and to try and get these regional organizations working together again and back on track for the big free trade area project.
Patrick, thank you very much. That was an incredible survey across the political, electoral and political landscape, I would say. And I think it also illustrated the difficulties that we are seeing at the global level, at the regional level, in the ability of established institutions to be able to do the role that we've depended on them for so long to do. And when those start fracturing, it has both economic and political repercussions. Now, I'm sure that there are questions being thought up in the audience as we go along. I'm going to progress with the panel and then take some questions towards the end. And Patrick has set us up very nicely to go into our second speaker. And Razia is going to take us a little deeper into that question of the economic circumstances and the debt question, because there is a lot of volatility still in the global economy as well as in the regional economy. But those old ideas of IMF austerity and the fear that that brings at all levels amongst political classes and also the grassroots in Africa is back again. So Razia, over to you to give us your perspective on that.
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you also, Patrick. I thought I had the rather grim role as the economist in the room, but Patrick's outlining of the political events to look to in 2024, I think really did a very good job of driving home the challenges that the region faces. I'm going to focus a little bit on the economic underpinnings of all of this. First of all, what has been going on with African growth for some time now? 2014, we saw the collapse of energy prices alongside other commodity prices. 2015, real concerns around China's growth. Could it be sustained or not? 2018, emerging market crises. 2020, the COVID crisis, a coordinated downturn the world over, which hit African economies particularly hard. Let's not forget that the slow rollout of vaccines in the region meant that many African economies had experienced COVID-related shutdowns for an even longer period. And as if that shock were not bad enough, 2022, not only Russia, Ukraine, the impact on food prices, consumption baskets in Africa tend to be very much food dominated, but also the inflation shock in developed markets. Inflation, the likes of which we hadn't seen in about 40 years, a very concerted, aggressive in the end, tightening cycle on the part of developed market central banks, and a whole new host of challenges for African governments trying to contend with this multitude of different external shocks. Despite all of this, there is a sense of some optimism in 2024. Why is this? When we at Standard Chartered look at the outlook for 2024, we've titled our outlook A Soft Landing with Risks. Despite the very rapid tightening that we've seen in the US, the economy still seems to be doing okay. A lot of growth indicators are continuing. Just this week, we'll get another Fed meeting, and the expectation is they won't signal necessarily that they're about to cut rates imminently because economic data is still relatively strong. For the rest of the world, this does matter. If we were to see signs of developed economies slowing really rapidly, that would mean risk aversion on the part of many investors. That would deprive many African countries, many emerging markets, of the capital flows, the investment that they really need. So it's probably good news for everyone that we might see something of a soft landing. The end to that excessive inflation that we had seen in recent years, this is the hope. We can't ignore the conflict in the Middle East. We know that oil markets are not pricing in anything like a significant geopolitical risk premium. This means, in layperson's terms, if the conflict were to escalate, chances are oil markets haven't factored that in just yet, and there could well be further pressure on oil prices, which would be very bad news for the region's oil importers. But leaving that aside, there is another risk that everyone is watching on a global scale, and this is China. We know that the accession of China to the WTO, China's rise in the early 2000s, had a significant impact on African growth. The commodity boom that many African exporters saw at that time, the rise in investment from China, was a key part of the Africa growth experience that we were seeing in those years, when many more economies in the region were growing at about the rate of 7%. Why is 7% important? Because if it's sustained for at least a decade, that effectively implies that an economy is doubling in size every 10 years. The reality is 7% type growth has been very difficult for African economies to achieve in the recent past. We see pockets of this. Côte d'Ivoire, very good football result last night, for those of you who stayed up late enough. But it's more the exception than the norm. In 2024, we think the growth leaders in the region are going to be the likes of Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, but this is more driven by hydrocarbons production, first oil and gas potentially in Senegal, as Patrick suggested, a more complicated political backdrop than we've traditionally seen in that economy, probably not unrelated. But in a lot of other economies where we used to take for granted the ability to grow at this rate that would really be transformative, economically transformative, we're just not seeing that kind of growth rate. So what are the expectations for this year? Well, the good news is capital market issuance, the ability of African countries to be able to borrow internationally on commercial terms. I can't say too much about the Ivorian issuance because we're still restricted, but we did see for the first time since 2022 a sub-Saharan African country being able to tap international capital markets relatively comfortably. And therefore, all the concerns of recent years around which countries are going to succumb to higher interest rates, which countries would spiral into debt defaults, they haven't completely gone away. Everyone is looking very closely at the Egypt situation. The IMF is in town. Will they require a further devaluation in Egypt? Could this be destabilizing? What impact does it have on Egypt's own debt sustainability if the central bank there is forced to raise interest rates to try to combat inflation, if it has to do that very sharply? The debt concerns haven't entirely gone away, but there is this sense in 2024 that maybe we've turned the corner. We started out at the end of 2023 with markets thinking the Fed has been dovish recently. At some point over the next year, we've got to get an easing of these very tight conditions. And maybe this supports risk-taking. Maybe this means some African countries can borrow again, can refinance their upcoming obligations. And apart from Ethiopia's default, just before Christmas, there isn't necessarily an expectation that other Eurobond issuers are likely to default again. I'm looking at the clock, but I'm not sure that's entirely accurate. It's been stuck at the same time the whole way through. So I'll try to wrap this up very quickly. What are the big concerns? What are we focusing on? Patrick mentioned South Africa. Patrick mentioned Nigeria. Both important very politically, hugely important economically. Last year was a testing year for Nigerian reform. Almost from the get-go, one of the boldest economic reforms you can imagine any Nigerian government delivering, the removal of the fuel subsidy. This, of course, exacerbated pre-existing inflationary pressures, but markets rallied in response. They thought, here is a government that's finally willing to do the really difficult things, to set growth on the path that it needs to be on in the future. There is a great deal of pain involved in the near term. One of the other things that everyone is watching very closely is Nigeria's foreign exchange reforms. The good news is the gap between the official market and the parallel market has been entirely closed. The bad news is the Naira continues to weaken on the official market. What is needed is a much more comprehensive tightening of monetary conditions in Nigeria. It is going to be fiscally painful in the near term, but the playbook for how to do this is well known. There is no other way to stabilize the currency other than to tighten the conditions that are in place. And investors are optimistic. They think that with the difficult reforms, the politically contentious reforms having been tackled somewhat unexpectedly and much earlier on, maybe this is the good basis to see developments that will bring about greater stability in Nigeria's economy. Nigeria has lagged far behind with oil production. We're now starting to see the acceleration of approvals that allow for Nigerian companies to play a bigger role in Niger Delta production. And a lot of the international oil companies are exiting. Maybe if this continues, we'll start to see some turnaround in Nigerian prospects. So plenty to focus on there. Very quickly on South Africa, a big election year. Everyone is fixated with the polls. The IMF recently downgraded its growth forecast for South Africa, thinking that logistical issues, the poor state of the ports and the road infrastructure, may just hold back growth. But the good news is, for an economy that had been tested by severe power shortages, we've seen real success with the embrace of renewables in South Africa. The amount of rooftop solar generation installed last year grants greater resilience to households. They were, of course, tax incentivized to go down this route. And a lot has been done using tax policy in South Africa, dismantling the traditional monopoly position of the state-owned company Eskom in generation to allow for the embrace of greater renewables in the future. It was done out of necessity, but there's no question that it's moving the country in the right direction. So we're a little bit more optimistic than the IMF on growth. We think that the impact of these earlier reforms is going to start to be felt. We also think that with inflation coming down, maybe there'll be some scope for interest rate easing, granting relief to consumers. The big unknown still is about the debt restructuring. You'll have heard plenty of mention of this. Ethiopia, how difficult is it going to be? Zambia thought it had reached a deal with external creditors last year, only for the official creditors to turn around and say they didn't quite like the nature of what had been agreed with Eurobond creditors. This has driven home the message that even when a country goes into default on its external debt, it can be a very difficult situation to work out of. The whole idea behind the Common Framework restructuring was to provide enough breathing space to countries to be able to rebuild, their foreign exchange reserves to create conditions for greater macroeconomic stability, future growth, and only then to restart the payment of external debt. These are principles that we would do well to remember in terms of looking at the difficulties still facing many African economies today, and in terms of the workout of these situations, which have looked incredibly difficult. So I could go on for a long, long time. I'm sure there'll be plenty of time to explore this in the Q&A. I'll just summarize the big picture view. We have seen years and years of missed opportunities for growth in Africa. It has been a series of external shocks, one after the other. Less than very conducive governance, less than great governance has also played a role in the outcomes that we see today. But we're also seeing, in economy after economy, some more so than others, the embrace of reform, usually out of necessity. There's been a great deal of bearishness about African growth. It's not difficult to beat the consensus and to actually do better with the embrace of reform. So on the whole, for the global economy, we may see a soft landing with risks. The risks are very real. In the case of Africa, because sentiment had turned so pessimistic, there is still this expectation that maybe individual countries will end up doing better. We're not going to see a sustained growth experience. The external environment doesn't necessarily lend itself to fixing the issues for every single economy. But with the right focus on reform, 2024 could well surprise by many more economies pulling in the right direction. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you, Razia. That was an amazing, great appreciation from the audience there. Thank you. That was an amazing run through, really full of insights. And there's a couple of things that I would just pick on there, because we talked a lot about oil and gas prices, about energy, and also actually about food security and resilience. And in a way, all of this debt, governments borrow, not just for the sake of borrowing, they borrow to do things. And the agenda on which they try to have an impact for their people cuts across both development, climate action, even human security in different ways. And I think it leads us nicely into the presentation that we're going to get from Omnia here, who is we just had Omnia, the COP28. And you were there, you were also there at COP27. And I think it would be really great to hear from you how you see that progression. You were appointed as the first youth envoy at COP27 as a young professional. Omnia is a surgeon and is currently also studying here in London at Imperial College, I think. And that is actually an indication that when we bring youth into the discussion of anything, whether it's politics, economics, climate action, we're not just saying this is something for the future. We're saying that this is real people, real professionals, real entrepreneurs, real employers and employees now. So Omnia, over to you to give us your perspective. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for this incredible overview of the current political and economic situation in Africa. And it really brings in, the nexus between geopolitics, health, and climate. And we know that climate change is the single biggest threat to health of the 21st century, as announced by the World Health Organization many years ago. And in the climate space, we particularly see a big focus on climate mitigation, on carbon emission reduction, but very little when it comes to adaptation and resilience. We can see that, for example, with global climate finance, when it actually decreased from 7 to 5% of global climate finance that goes to adaptation, to building people's resilience, as well as countries to be able to adapt to cope with the impacts of climate change over only 2 years, from 2019 to 2022. And when you also think about resilience, we think about the devastating health impacts of climate-related disasters, from floods to hurricanes to other extreme weather events, food insecurity, water insecurity, drought, as well as the impacts on people's mental health and their own resilience, being able to cope with the changing climate that they have contributed the least to, but they are the most affected and marginalized communities. And less than 0.5% of global climate finance goes to solutions that address both the health impacts of climate change. So in Egypt, it was the first time in 7 years that the UN Climate Change Conference, which is the central and the most effective multilateral process around climate negotiations and discussions, it was the first time to be held in Egypt, and the first time in 7 years in Africa. And in Egypt, we wanted to change the narrative from focusing on mitigation into focusing on adaptation. And we believe that this is what our region and our continent needed, to have that same interest, that same political investment, as well as financial investments in the agenda of adaptation. And this is why we pushed in for the first time a program called the Global Goal on Adaptation, because we know in the Paris Agreement we have this goal of reducing carbon emissions to net zero by 2050, but we don't have the same for adaptation. It's very fragmented. People don't know what sectors can do, what is the return on investment on it, does it benefit economies. It seems like a very not attractive agenda to focus on. And this is why in Egypt we wanted to create a goal. We wanted to have a specific program so that when we commit to adaptation, when countries invest in that, they have the way to do it, the means of implementation, the finance that is needed. But what also caught the headlines of the global countries around the world was loss and damage, because for the first time ever, a fund was established in Egypt where countries, the developed countries that contributed the most to the carbon emissions, are now going to pay reparations for the most vulnerable countries, for the small state islands, for the communities that have been affected and damaged by the climate-related effects and events. And this was when the Loss and Damage Fund was established because of that. So these are two key important things that came out of COP27. But what was also important was in the lead up to COP28, which was in the UAE, we had the first ever Africa Climate Summit, the first summit that was held in Nairobi in Kenya. And the main objective was it aimed to change the narrative of around how climate change is addressed in Africa, that we need African-led solutions, that we need to platform the needs of the African communities. One example of that, not only did the President, William Ruto, really push for having more investments in renewable energy in Africa, but also there were many, over 1,000 people came to the Africa Climate Summit, most of them coming from the grassroots African communities, sharing their own needs and where they need the investments to run to when it comes to their adaptation and resilience. One example is a session that I attended around mental health and climate change. And many of the participants and the speakers in this session were women from the Maasai communities who shared how climate change is affecting them. How is it increasing gender-based violence in their communities because of the scarcity of resources? How many farmers are losing their lives to suicide because they can no longer provide food and income for their families because of the drought, and they had no idea that this was because of climate change, because of climate-related and fossil fuel-driven pollution that has led to the global environmental changes that is leading to these climate effects that they are experiencing the hardest, with very little support and investment in their own resilience and providing mental health care and psychosocial support services for them. Investing in mental health care services alone that can save up to $47 billion when we look at these impacts because of climate-related events, access to green spaces, as well as fossil fuel air pollution. But when we look at where the finance is going, where is it provided, we know that this year alone, the fossil fuel subsidies increased from 5 to 7%. This means $7 trillion are chosen to subsidize fossil fuel instead of investing in clean sources of energy. And this is a big issue for Africa because over 600 million people in Africa, more than 40% of the entire population, has no access to electricity. And even if they do, it's not a clean source of energy. So it is energy poverty, it is also air pollution, and it is also affecting the health of their children, their adolescents, and young people the most. So in the lead up to that, following the Africa Climate Summit, we saw another historical achievement during COP28, which was the first time in the outcome decision of COP28 in the UAE, there was a mention of transitioning away from fossil fuel and recognizing how we need to do that. Of course, there were more expectations, not just to transition away and not just have a good headline or words on a declaration, but to actually have a phase out of fossil fuels. For this phase out to be equitable, for countries in Africa and in other developing settings to be supported in order to transition to renewable energy and to do that equitably without damaging their own economies and providing them with the clean sources of energy that they needed. But to answer your other question around young people and the role of young experts in these processes, so in Egypt, for the first time in 27 years, a youth envoy was appointed. And this came from the idea of how can we as Egypt bring in the perspectives of African young people at the center of the climate discussions? Because it has been a challenge for many years. Challenges when it comes to visa, when it comes to funding, to get accommodation, to be able to go to these global conferences that normally take place either in Europe and in North America or other regions that are inaccessible for many African youth. So we wanted to appoint a young person, a young representative, and the task was to bring in the perspectives of young people and their solutions in a way that is meaningful to them. And the way that I did that together with the COP presidency and a youth task force is that we designed opportunities for diverse young people from all around the world to be able to speak in open intergenerational discussions with the negotiators, with the chairs of the country groups, with the ministers. We organized for the first time ever a youth-led climate forum where we invited the ministers and the negotiators to come in the same roundtable, not in a panel discussion, but in a roundtable discussion, discussing what are the policy recommendations, solutions that young people would like to see, both on mitigation and just transition, as well as on loss and damage and adaptation. And I was responsible together with the young people who organized the forum to bring in these policy recommendations directly into the COP27 outcome. And in the outcome of COP27, which we also refer to as the Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Plan, we had mandated the next presidency of COP to appoint a youth envoy. We also mandated the next presidency to create the same policy forum where young people are seen as equal stakeholders, working with the ministers, with the negotiators, to bring in their perspectives sustainably into the outcome of this political process. And we also had, for the first time ever, a dedicated youth-led space, which was the Children and Youth Pavilion. And this space was led by young people, where we invited the policy experts to come to this space to listen to the young people's needs and their solutions, and to do that over the 2 weeks of COP, from the morning until the early evenings in the conference. And then what was very inspiring to see is that this role of a youth envoy in COP28 was permanently institutionalized. And this is the first time ever that every single presidency coming to COP is mandated to appoint a youth champion in their role. And this means that we are not only trying to fight for our voices to be integrated, there's a young representative in this presidency team that makes sure that the perspectives of young people is integrated at the center of these discussions. What was interesting also during COP28 was a pledge that was done by the UAE government in order to dedicate 200 million US dollars to children in Africa, focusing on climate and health. This is a great initiative, and many countries are doing the same, but it also poses the question of, is this what children in Africa need? And what does it mean when we look at this amount of pledges that is being committed? Is it going to be for their health? What do we mean by their health? Is it for treating infectious diseases in children in Africa? Is it about empowering them with education? Is it about providing mental health care services for them? And is it about providing food and water for them? And who gets to define these priorities? Is it foreign governments who are giving this pledge? Is it philanthropies? Or is it the local communities and the governments and the children and the young people who are doing these incredible grassroots activism that my fellow panelists will share? And it's just about really thinking about, when we look at funding, when we look at commitments, when we look at political decisions, who gets to define how this funding is going to be distributed, who gets to really elevate the work that is being done by young people, and having that representation of young people in political governance systems is very important. The idea of reinstitutionalization and having young people, instead of looking at how their voices can be integrated, no, we need to shift the narrative on what kind of youth-led solutions are we going to elevate, empower, and invest in. So that's it from my end.
Wow, thank you, Omnia. The passion and the commitment there, and this incredibly detailed knowledge of these circumstances that you're sharing with us is so powerful. And it's also very good questions. I think by the end of COP28, $80 billion had been pledged into new financial things. If that 80 billion was moving out of those funds down to where it's needed, we'd be seeing more progress. But actually to access that funding at a level below government is really difficult. So there's something that's needed there in this whole structuring of the way finances and funding and pledges works. And as you said, that takes us nicely on to our next panelist, Samia, who is here. Again, looking at grassroots activism and the question of justice. We've talked a lot about fairness, we talk about access, we talk about inclusion. How do we really bring in the concept of justice and community grassroots activism to make a change? If we talk about energy transition, that's something that's very hot in this country. It's also very hot in countries throughout Africa. So how does that community-led activism come out?
So hello everyone, my name is Samia Dumbuya. I'm a climate justice advocate. And I've been in this game for 10 years now. And the reason why I entered this game was because I experienced environmental justice growing up in East London, particularly with the issue of air pollution, where air pollution is rife in Black and brown communities across London. And as I was exploring this journey, I came across case studies outside of the UK, where I learned air pollution was another issue that was experienced by young Africans too. So I've collaborated with people. So my home country is Sierra Leone. I was born and raised in the UK, but I'm very connected to my home and to my family, just because that is where my people are at, and that's why I feel a sense of home. And yeah, as a climate justice advocate, I always like to explain to people who has the right to live in a toxic-free environment. And when we're looking at the just energy transition, we see especially European institutions such as the EU, they see themselves as pioneer in building a green, sustainable future. They paint it as a glossy picture where everyone lives in clean areas, environments where there's access to green spaces, but people don't look at the supply chain side of that. So that's kind of where I come in as a climate justice advocate, where when we're looking at electric vehicles, for example, everyone looks at it, it's like, oh, this is such an amazing, fun, innovative solution. But we all know that Europe has its eyes on the African continent, particularly in mineral-rich countries. And we're moving towards an era where Europe wants an uninterrupted supply of green technologies, meaning that they are accelerating with these solutions without taking into consideration the lives that they are affecting on the African continent. And we're seeing that across social media. I'm not sure if people have seen recent videos in DRC, where we saw the mining conditions have been very poor, unacceptable for African people. We're seeing children working in mines. And when people look at this supply chain, they just say, oh, well, like, this is for the better of the environment. We're lowering carbon emissions. This is the best for the global community. But what people aren't considering is that this is a form of green colonialism where we're not allowing African communities to recover from the harms that have been inflicted by Western society. So as a climate justice advocate, I like to pull resources together, connect with different youth networks across the continent, figure out ways that we can voice our opinions, what we want for African communities in the future, not just for the future, but also the present too, and also figure out where we get this funding. And I kind of like what the panelists said earlier about debt. Debt is such a huge obstacle when it comes to building climate resilient solutions. And we're seeing that the main obstacle for grassroots to thrive in African countries is funding. Restricted funding is a big issue. lots of African communities, especially young people, they know what they want to get out of the just energy transition. They're asking for better working conditions, they're asking for better wages, and they're also asking for the economies to diversify itself, meaning that if I live in a mineral-rich country, why is the only successful industry that exists within my community extractivism? Artisanal mining is a huge problem in Central Africa right now. We're seeing young people, youngest the age of 5, participate in artisanal mining, where they're extracting minerals such as lithium, cobalt, which is highly requested for green technologies to succeed. And this is a controversial issue right now because people say, well, we want a green future, but then we need these resources. But there are ways to plan roadmaps and pathways to make sure that this is a win-win solution. Right now, we're not seeing European Green Deals excluding African voices from their deals, from their agreements, just because they have disregard for African lives. And I know I can talk about this for hours, but essentially what people are doing, is particularly in South Africa, for example, there's a coalition called Life After Coal. You have lots of young South Africans coming together and saying, this is what we want our country to look like. We want more investment in renewable energy. 90% of the industry right now is coal mines, and that is causing environmental pollution, not just for air, but water and land. We're seeing environmental degradation. People saying, how far are we gonna go just to ensure that Europeans get what they want? And as a climate justice advocate, I always like to highlight the asymmetrical power dynamics between the global north and the global south. I'm really happy that Omnia is on the panel because I think she's a great example of how our voices can enter these political spaces. And I love how you opened the door for young people to come in and say, hey, I want to enter this room too. And I think we should actually celebrate the fact that Youth Envoys is part of, the norm for the next COPs that are coming. We need more young people in these spaces because right now we're seeing young voices being left out of these discussions. And I'm glad you brought up mental health as well. Research shows that 70 to 80% of young people across the world are experiencing eco-anxiety. They fear what the future holds for them. People are worried about job security, land security, food security, all issues that are affected by the climate crisis. So I'm just going to end there, and I would just like to say, please support African voices that are working on the ground, not just people who are working on government levels, but people who are actually calling for change from the ground.
Fantastic. Samia, thank you, because it's actually so important to hear from the reality on the ground. We can look at the politics, we can look at the economics, and we have to, because that's what governs things. But at the same time, politics and economics are there for us, whoever us are, wherever we are in the world. And we've got to find a way to get those voices in. And thank you for sharing that. And I know you've got loads more examples as we go into the questions. But I think it takes me also on, nicely, see how well planned we were, to our final panelist, Moki Makura, who is online. Are we seeing Moki? Yes, there she is. Because one of the things that I think we've threaded through all of the presentations tonight has been narrative. Actually, the stories, the way we're displaying each of these specialist segments for our audience here in the room and online is also very, very important because it's about how we present. Narrative can take it in one direction or the other. It can be a younger or an older or a north or a south or whatever it may be. And I think it's really important. And when we look at the creative industries themselves are creating narratives. And we can both say we can celebrate the creativity and culture that is coming out of the continent of Africa, all 54 countries, all so many different peoples. And at the same time, we can also wonder what can we learn from their creativity and their ability to create narratives in the right way and bring those into the other parts of our life more effectively. So Moki, I'm going to hand over this space to you and see how you can inspire us as we listen to your thoughts this evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. So my contribution really is around what we can expect from the creative industries in 2024. And to your point about the importance of stories and narrative, the creators of stories and narrative are storytellers. Storytellers are the creatives. So what happens with them underpins everything we do, because you can't change perceptions about Africa. All the economic interventions, everything we do won't change unless we as Africans and the world starts believing in us. And it starts with our storytellers. And when I think about how, when I was younger, I viewed somewhere like the United States, it wasn't because I read Pentagon papers or I knew what the defense forces were doing or what the budgets were. It was because I watched movies like Top Gun. It really was. They were a powerful tool for influence. And I think a country like America has realized the role of creatives. In fact, I think the Pentagon actually has, liaison people who deal with Hollywood to make sure their depiction of, of weaponry and American power is, authentic. I think Africa is coming to this realization about the power and influence and the soft power that our creative industries have a little bit later. And there's good reason for it. I mean, I know the African Union in 2021, they declared, that year, every year they have a theme. That year was arts, culture, and heritage, which was really, I think, the first time we were sort of officially recognized. The reality is, our soft power, our music, our food, our film, our art has really changed the way the world sees us. Think about African music. I mean, there is no corner in the world you can go to where you will not hear Afrobeats or Calm Down or Burna Boy or Wizkid. And it's really changed. It's helped us change the way the world is experiencing us. Because typically when you heard about Africa, it was normally a problem. It was a bad election, there's conflict, there's coup. But now when people hear about Africa, they're talking about Burna Boy, they're talking about, our fashion designers, they're talking about our films. So for me, I think the creative industry right now is being recognized, and it is entirely because of the talent there is on this continent. This industry is primarily self-regulated. There's been very little government intervention, very little policy to guide it. Look at Nollywood in Nigeria, entirely self-made industry, and look how successful it's become. So there are kind of three things I think we can look forward to in 2024. And I sort of put it all in a big bag, and I said it's the year of more for the creative industry. There are three big things. One, I think we're going to continue and see more transparency, more data, which allows the world to access what's going on in the creative industry. And I'll come back to it. The second thing is, I think we're definitely going to see much more investment. And the third thing is, I think we are, therefore, as a result of the first two, going to see a lot more opportunity. So let me just talk a little bit about the transparency. Africa No Filter, which is the organization I run, we work with creatives, and we are actually a narrative change organization trying to change the way the world sees Africa and how Africa sees itself. We did some research into narratives around doing business in Africa. And one of the things that we saw, and this was in 2022, that less than 1% of the business coverage about Africa, those are business stories by business media outlets, was on the creative and cultural industry. So if traditionally people are talking about the creative industry, it's usually about, the celebrity aspect of it, but very few articles were actually about the business of the creative economy. More recently, I think it was 2021, UNESCO put out a report on the film industry, saying that, the film industry in Africa accounts for something like $5 billion in GDP across the continent. They also more recently did something on the fashion industry, saying $31 billion. That's the value of the fashion industry in Africa. The art market is worth about $1.8 billion. And the fact that people are looking into the data is always a good sign. But private organizations, PwC did something on the music industry in Nigeria, what it's valued at. There's more organizations talking about money in the creative economy. It's not just, the entertainment business is called that because it is a business. But now we're beginning to see that value as Africans. Africa No Filter, we did something called a Creative Vibrancy Index, where we looked at 12 African cities to see actually, what is the creative infrastructure that's going to enable this, so-called explosion in the creative sector? And we looked at 12 cities, and we looked at things like, what's a cultural vibrancy? How many venues are there? Facilities, museums, art galleries, cinemas. I mean, for example, Africa supposedly has about 1,600 cinema screens across the continent, something like 40,000 in the US. Now, if we want to grow the film industry, we need more cinemas. I think there's a perception that everybody's watching everything on their phones. It's not the case in Africa. But data allows us to see that. Data allows us to see the opportunity. We also looked at, not just the cultural vibrancy as in, what's going on in terms of infrastructure, also the enabling environment government is providing. How much censorship is there? How much governance is there? And finally, we looked at the creative economy. How much education, I mean, people being skilled to do these jobs, and how much capital investment is actually going on. And just in terms of the index, just to let you know, Johannesburg was the most culturally vibrant city of the 12 cities we looked at. And Lagos was the one that sort of came tops in its creative economy. Incidentally, Cairo had the most, sort of facilities and venues. But again, the point about this is there is just a lot more insight into this sector as a business opportunity. The second thing I talked about was the fact there'd be more investment. So if you're in the creative industry, you will know that Afreximbank launched a fund for the creative sector. So they're investing in all, across the board from fashion to film. And I think more recently they launched a $1 billion film fund. The African Development Bank's also been supporting, the fashion industry. The banks are in there. The venture capitalist companies in there. There's a company called Heather Fund in Kenya who's also doing something similar. Private sector are in there. We all know about Netflix and the amount of investment it's made into Africa, mind you, just 2 countries. Amazon is in there. There's a number of independent film producers who are investing in film. When you look at the art market, the art auctioneers are not African. And the reason why these art auctioneers are in the business is there is money to be made. Sotheby's, Bonhams, Christie's. I mean, I think Sotheby's was responsible for auctioning the highest value piece of African art. It was an Ethiopian-American artist, and I think her piece of work sold for something like $9 million, a single piece of artwork. So there is money to be made because there's demand for this. I mean, our fashion industry, export sectors were valued at $15.5 billion. I mean, I don't know how many of you have last been to an African Fashion Week. Apparently there are 32 African Fashion Weeks across Africa. That means there is money to be made because there is demand for it. But one thing I have been stressing the economy side of it, the investment side of it, but I think a really important part is that if you look at developed countries and how they have evolved and how the creative sector, artists and musicians have evolved, a lot of that has not been through commercial investment. A lot of that has been through philanthropic funding. So if you look at the big American families, Rockefeller, Carnegie, a lot of investment was made philanthropically into the arts. And that, I think, is still an important space for us to hold. Africa No Filter is a philanthropic funder. We are one of the very few arts funders. We have things like the Last Mile Film Fund. We've done a comedy fellowship. And the reason why I make this point is that we are one of the very, very few funders of the arts in Africa. And I think that space needs to open up because not every piece of art provides a return on investment immediately. There is a creative economy, there is a business aspect for it, but there is also art for pure art's sake, and we mustn't forget that. And the sort of last opportunity the last thing I want to talk about in terms of the 3 opportunities, or the 3 things I foresee for 2024 is opportunity. I mean, all of this sort of creative economy, all the activity, all the attention our creative economy is getting and our creatives are getting means that it's going to create more jobs. Africa No Filter did a report called Africa's Soft Power. I think we did this about 2 years ago, and we interviewed 4,500 Africans, young Africans across 9 countries. 85% of them said that arts and culture were critical parts of their societies. So the great thing is that we recognize the need for creativity, for arts, for culture. But having said that, only 4% of them worked in the sector. And I think there's 2 reasons for that. Number one, the perception is that you won't make money if you're in the creative sector. I don't know how many Africans in there that are trained lawyers because that's what their parents wanted, and they ended up realizing they were actually creative and moved over. And to this day, I mean, there is still a perception that you're not going to make money if you're creative, and that you have to go into legal or finance or be an economist. And I think that still needs some time to make people change. But also, I think there's this misunderstanding about the creative industry, that if you are in the creative industry, you are creative. Look at the film industry. Your average film, say in Hollywood, hires about nearly 300 people to put a film to bed. If you ever look at the credits, probably about 20, 30 of them are actors with speaking roles. The rest of them are technical, the editors, the lighting person. There's so much that needs actual skill, not just creativity. And that's where I think the jobs will come. But with that, you need proper training. We need the infrastructure to train this generation of people who are going to enable the creative industry to happen. I mean, I think this UNESCO report said something like 5 million people are employed by the film industry in Africa. Only 5 million. There's so much more. So we have a lot to go, but I'm just going to end on the key drivers that I think are driving this whole kind of, I guess, interest and attention for the creative industry. One is the diaspora. Absolutely, without the diaspora's participation and consumption of our creative outputs, we would not be sitting here talking about the creative industry today. Look at things like the Year of Return in Ghana, Dirty December in Nigeria, our artists selling out O2 in London. And there's so much of it going on. And that's being driven by the diaspora, and we have to continue to harness that. The second thing is social media. Absolutely, social media plays a critical role in just democratizing the market, getting rid of the middleman. So, for example, if you're a fashion designer, you don't need a shop. You basically need an Instagram account. And, I just came back from Nigeria, and every time I said, oh, where can I go and get this? Everyone's like, oh, look on Instagram. And there were a bunch of really creative people doing, selling, trading. So I've looked at diaspora, social media, and the third point really is the youth. I mean, we all know that Africa is the youngest continent. And we have youth on our side, and youth often equates with creativity. And I use the example of people like Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, all of these massive innovations and creativity they took to start up these phenomenal businesses were done when they were young. And Bill has actually been quoted from my understanding that he could not have started up something like Microsoft when he was in his mid-50s. He did it when he was young, because that's when you're most creative. So we've certainly got that on our side. And I'm going to stop there. Because as you can tell, I have a passion for this sector, and I think there's so much happening. But thank you.
Vicky, thank you very much. I think that was, again, like all of our panelists, an enormous range over this whole question of creative industries. And as you well reminded us, it's a whole collection of different skills and an economy of its own. And when you think about, 5 million people in the creative industries or in the film industry in Africa, that's almost like we're talking about one place when we've actually got 54 countries. We could be thinking not everyone will have a thriving film industry like anywhere else, but certainly I'm sure there should be more than that, way more than that. But of course we also have and you mentioned youth, we've also got the question of technology now, and how much artificially generated effects, shall we say, go into the film industry's full stop now. So there's an enormous amount that goes into this whole idea of creativity and narratives. I think our narrative arc has come to the point where we try to share with the space with the audience and see if we have some questions coming in. And I'm hoping to see some questions. I can see a couple of hands raised. If you wouldn't mind telling us your name, where you're from, or what you'd like us to indicate you by, and who your question's for. Let's take the lady here, and then the gentleman here's got his microphone, then the lady behind.
Hi, my name's Sagar. My interest is in supply chains, and one of the last speakers was speaking about the impacts of all the minerals and the resources for the transition to net zero. This is something I was asking 10 years ago when we were being told to transition from fossil fuels to renewables. So I spent the last 10 years looking at it. No one's been able to tell me so far in the last 10 years what is the alternative to fossil fuels. People tell me wind turbines. I says, what energy are you using to make the cement and the steel? Fossil fuels. We are not divesting from fossil fuels. Renewables are not fossil fuel free. Fossil fuels were given to India, given to Africa during colonial times. If we divest from fossil fuels in those countries, we cannot expect them to make the wind turbines for us, because that is the very basis of their economy. We cannot expect solar panels to work when they're intermittent. We need them to be backed up by uranium, nuclear, and fossil fuels. This is the very reason why a small country in Africa called Niger and Burkina Faso kicked out the French eventually, after 60 years. So my question is, when the 80 billion euros or something was mentioned, my question is, what could you do with not just 80 billion euros, 500 billion euros every year for the last 50 years? This is in effect what has been taken fiscally and material-wise from those 7 countries of Western Africa by the French. So my question here is it really Africa that needs to be paying the debt to us, the interest? Or is it that the EU, France and Germany, all these countries, without the money coming from Senegal, all these countries, we would be in the basket, like Mitterrand said in the 90s. You guys do not need to pay us interest on the debt that we have taken from your countries for the last 50 years. It is us who have to be begging to you. Instead, we've broken off relationships very unintelligently, and now certain African countries are saying, hey, Mr. Putin, let's shake hands and do some deals. But Mr. Putin is all of a sudden some Satan as well. So my question is that it is not Africa that needs to pay us the interest. It is us who actually need to go to Africa and saying, we're going to stop ripping you off, we're going to stop maligning your people, and we have to either
I think that's
do
a comment
partnerships.
rather than a question. Focus on the question.
The question is, we have to ask, why is it we are still surviving on Africa money and fiscal policy? That's the question. We do not need to be paid the money on debt by Africa. It is us to have to pay back to them. And when are we going to count the resources and everything we're taking? Otherwise, all the other Western countries are going to be kicked out by Africa as well. When are we going to factor in all these resources and then look at the real value that we've been not taking, but literally just stealing from Africa? That's the United Nations, the IMF, the WHO. When those countries go, those institutions can get out of Africa, then you solve the problem. Thank you.
Hold on. Thank you for the question. Can we take another one or two, and then we'll come back to the panel?
Hello. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Alice. I'm an MPhil candidate in African Studies at the University of Cambridge. I'm writing my dissertation on Senegal, partially on the 2024 election. And so I was interested in the points that Mr. Smith brought up in his speech. And a major trend that I've noticed in my findings was that youth have had a really strong voice in that election, particularly university students. I know that young people have been a really important base for Ousmane Sonko, and a lot of the protests around the 2024 election have taken place on university campuses. And so I was wondering if you all could comment on sort of the larger trend of sort of how African youth across the countries that are having elections are sort of shaping political narrative and discourse, and like what role they're playing in their respective elections, because it seems to me that it's important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have we got Patrick online? Can we get, because I can't see on the screen. Patrick, can you hear us? There you are.
Yes,
can you take that one on the, and if you want to also comment on the first one, feel free.
Okay, sure. Well, firstly on the youth thing, yeah, I mean, it's an extremely important trend. Everyone got really excited last year about Nigeria with the Peter Obi candidacy, thinking this is really going to be a breakthrough. I mean, I have to say, Peter Obi is 61, but he was nevertheless the candidate of the youth, because the two other main candidates in the election were allegedly 71 and I think 76 respectively. But I think the important thing was the team around Obi were very much of the younger generation. They were the internet savvy, social media using populists. So I think what turned out there was they did incredibly well to get the votes they got, and Obi was catapulted into third place behind Atiku Abubakar, but came out almost from nowhere. He took over the Labour Party, which was a small trade union-backed party, and built a national network within 6 months of campaigning the election. So it was an incredible breakthrough. But I think he was up against two of the other sort of very experienced power politicians in the country, Atiku Abubakar and Bola Tinubu. But I think you're going to see this trend more and more. You're certainly seeing it in Ghana. A lot of young people I've spoken to in the time I've been here, when I've asked about the elections, they say none of the above. We're looking for a candidate who represents our generation, that is under 40, and certainly with a campaign that sort of resonates, again, with youth concerns. So I think you are seeing a much more activist demographic, youth demographic. At the moment, it tends to be, I think, very urban-based. But again, that is spreading out simply because of the interaction between urban areas and the hinterland, and the mutual dependency on the two zones. So I think youth politics is going to be an increasingly important thing to watch. I think the forthcoming elections in South Africa are going to be very, very interesting on that, and in Ghana. Just on the first question, when it comes to the money, there's a few things worth saying. I think on the so-called green transition, the UN has estimated that the cost of this transition will require $4 trillion a year for the next 15 years. I mean, that just seems to be a stratospheric cost, right? Of which, interestingly enough, they're saying 25% of that would go to developing economies, and 75% would go to the rich economies, which would include China and Europe and North America. So even in terms of the great renewable energy perspective, you've still got a massive global inequality about access to energy and use of fossil fuels. And I hear what the speaker was saying. The issue in Africa is absolutely energy access, and also the historic debt of industrialized countries that have polluted the world and heated the biosphere to the extent we now have this climate crisis. But I think the UN figure about 4 trillion is worth keeping in mind when you look at how the IMF, and then the IMF, not a radical economic organization, calculates the cost of fossil fuel subsidies every year. So the fossil fuel subsidies at the moment have an indirect cost of 1.5 trillion a year. But if you add in all the implied costs and all the displacement of renewable energy by cheaper fossil fuel and subsidized fossil fuel energy, you get up to $7 trillion a year. So the fossil fuel industry is being subsidized, according to the IMF, to the tune of $7 trillion a year. So that makes actually an investment program of investing $4 trillion a year in renewable energy quite doable. Now, I mean, those figures are so stratospheric, you really, and I'm sure Razia would have a lot to say about them. But that's, as I said, these are not put together by, fantasists on LSD. These are put together by, bean-counting IMF economists. And it does, to me, set out the dilemma. the international financial system is not coming to grips with this climate finance issue in any shape or form. And whatever goes on at the COP summits really doesn't reflect the reality that if we want to transition to green energy for the majority of people in the world, we need to find ways to get that investment to those economies, to get them the energy access, and to put them, all the economies in the world, on a green, renewable path. And then we'll be on the road to success. But we need to have an honest conversation before we can do that.
Thank you. Just a super quick comment on the point that Patrick raised. The good news, as I see it, is that in economy after economy, the dawning of this concept that fossil fuel subsidies are unaffordable, we're either seeing them being reduced or we're seeing them removed. And this is something that I think we should be celebrating. It's very difficult to look to the future of Africa 10 years from now. It's not by any means the only region that subsidizes fossil fuels. It's nowhere near being the worst culprit. But in Africa, it is a region where we're seeing real change in terms of the scaling back of the extent of those fossil fuel subsidies. I'm sure Samia has a lot more to say on the point of climate justice. So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for raising up that question. I will say in the climate justice movement, there is a wide call for climate reparations, where people are asking for the cancellation of debt, especially debt with atrocious interest rates on them. And I will invite you to a festival that's actually coming up, which is hosted by War on Want, where it's called And Still We Rise. And that's an international network of movements where people are calling for the cancellation of debt, but also trying to imagine and vision the pathways forward. And a lot of people within that network are on the African continent as well. So I invite you to engage with that, because there are people who are actively talking about this and finding ways to shape fiscal policies around that. And just to talk about the lack of energy access on the continent, the International Energy Agency says $25 billion needs to be invested annually for the next 20 years to close the energy access gap on the African continent. And as a climate justice activist, people expect me to constantly say no to fossil fuels, which I am inherently, but the reality is that this supply chain will always exist for the future that many countries want, especially when it comes to terms of international development. And that is why people on the ground are asking for, we want to be upskilled when it comes to engineering. We want to be trained so that we have more power and say in these industries. Because right now, people feel that they have access to poor equipment, which affects their health and safety when they work in extractive industries. People are asking for, hey, if you're going to be in our countries, could you subsidize engineering degrees? Could you actually invest in STEM initiatives, ensuring that women and young girls enter this industry? And also invest in technologies that don't emit a lot of pollution in their countries. And to move away from the macro and the big numbers, there are people showing international solidarity when it comes to climate reparations. So for example, there's a Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. I had to make sure I wrote that down because I knew I was gonna mess up their title. They support Senegalese communities who are asking for a just energy transition, and they actually pull funds and resources from Glasgow and send it to Senegal to ensure that their transition is equitable for everyone. So making sure that, because I think people find it difficult when we talk about reparations because we want this country's government to just send a buttload of money to another country. And it's like reparations actually need to be more tactical and strategic than that. So that is how international solidarity has been happening. And there's actually been lots of partnerships across Europe and African countries to make sure that a just energy transition is financed. It's not the perfect solution, but it's definitely something. And when it comes to climate solutions, I think we need to stray away from perfectionism, because perfectionism is actually a symptom of white supremacy. And as we're decolonizing systems, we need to make sure we're not reiterating and replicating systems that brought harm to these communities in the first place. So we need to make sure our processes mirror the values that we carry. If we're asking for equity and we're asking for democracy, we need to make sure our processes resemble that. So that's all I have to say on that.
Fantastic answer. Really, really comprehensive. Natasha, simply, even though we're right up on time, I think we have a question online. Can you summarize it? I think you were saying it was quite long. Is there a summary? Who's it for? Does it say who it's for?
For Patrick, is already on the chat, so he can answer.
Okay, it may be that if it's one that can be done through the chat, it would be great, because I think we're right up on time. Do we have any final question in the room? We have one there. Let's have one final question in the room. And who's it for? Oh, sorry, there were two. Okay, there are two. Oh, sorry. And then since I signaled to both of you, we'll take both of them. But be quick with the question, please, not a comment.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's an extremely interesting panel. I'm doing Africa for more than 15 years. It's the first time with the Royal African Society. Extremely interesting. Very quick question to Razia. Can you quickly comment to the summary on your opinion on Botswana and Zimbabwe? What's going on these two? And generally... with each other, or just no, generally, like your opinion, what's going on and in economy, from economic point of view at the moment in Botswana and in Zimbabwe? And also, if you can very quickly, all of you, if you can very quickly comment on the transport connectivity and how the transport connectivity within the continent, especially the visa regime between the countries, affect the whole economical and the governmental situation. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Esther Watanaimana, and I'm from Zimbabwe, and I'm also an MPhil candidate at the University of Cambridge. And my question's for Ms. Molly. You spoke a lot about like the changes in African narratives happening across the globe, and I was wondering how we can see this like mindset shift or consciousness happen on the continent more amongst African youth. So my question is, what changes and investments need to be made and implemented in the education system, especially the higher education system happening on the continent, that can support this shift in mindset towards like an Afrocentric mindset, and also to support the rising creative industry? Thank you.
Okay, so we could have a whole nother panel there with those two questions. What I suggest is, I think some of them we may be able to follow up offline. Razia, do you want to give a comment on some of the Zimbabwe, Botswana? And then I'm going to come to Moki.
It's actually what's happening in terms of visa deregulation. One topic that we didn't really spend a lot of time on was the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Very ambitious in terms of the desire to break down these intra-regional barriers. We know it's going to be difficult with physical trade simply because the infrastructure to support that does not exist. It's expensive to put in place. The trade complementarities aren't there. In this respect, the move by different African governments to say there is something else that we can do to foster intra-regionalism. What we can do is break down these artificial barriers that have stopped Africans from visiting other African countries. It's excellent news. It's to be welcomed. And the hope is that many more economies put this in place. I'll leave it there in the interest of time, and happy to take Zim and Botswana offline.
Well, that's an incredibly valuable offer. I want to say thank you. I know a couple of our panelists have had to go, and I think Moki had to drop off remotely as well. But I think it's been an amazingly broad conversation this evening, and that's what the Royal African Society likes to do. We do think that as a venue for sharing information, latest views, ideas, thoughts, analysis about Africa and from Africa, more importantly, all 54 countries, for people in the UK and more broadly is our core remit. And we don't mind what sector it is. We don't mind the age of it. We don't mind where people are coming from on the continent or what it is that they want to share with us, but we want to know more. And I think that's really what we're trying to do, and have these conversations and look forward. Next week, we're going to have edition 2 of the Prospects and Forecasts from a different aspect in the UK, up in Edinburgh. with a different panel, slightly different panel, some overlaps, but some differences, and a slightly different focus as well. So part 2, you get a second go at it, another version. Those who can't necessarily travel up to Edinburgh can sign up and join us online. And my final point really is also to pick up on the creative industries, because Moki gave me the great opportunity, because also for the Royal African Society this year is our film festival year. So Film Africa 2024 is coming your way in October, thereabouts, towards the end of October, for 10 days or so. And bringing a wonderful selection of new and upcoming films from the continent. So put that in your back pockets, and we'll be sending information about that round later. But for now, since we've already overrun our time, thank you very much for joining us in person and online. We hope to see some of you next week, and we hope to see you at other events from the Royal African Society. If you're not joined up as a member, get in touch and join us, because that way we'll have even more opportunities to engage with you. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to those who organised in the room. Thank you to our comms who've been tweeting all night. And we'll see safe journey home. Thank you.